Hello and welcome to our Wednesday webinar from the International Center for Sustainable Carbon. My name is Benedicta and I'm part of the communications team here. Our monthly webinars are based on our technical reports, which are available from our website sustainable-carbon.org. Residents of member countries and employees of our sponsoring organizations can download our reports at no charge after a one-off registration on the website. Please type any questions in the questions box as we go along and we'll answer them at the end of this webinar. The subject for today's webinar is hubs and clusters for CCUS, their role in decarbonisation, presented by Dr. Stephen Mills. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Benedicta. Well, today I'm going to tell you something about my latest report that looks at the growing interest around the world in the development of the so-called hubs and cluster model. This is increasingly the focus of decarbonisation efforts in a number of countries. I'm having a problem, Benedicta. I can't get the slides to proceed. I'm not sure what. But bear with me a second. We may have a slight technical hitch.
Try the left corner button with your mouse. That might work. If the arrow keys doesn't work, yeah, that's it all the way left.
Ah, okay, I think we're away. Apologies for the delay, everyone. Right, we'll be looking briefly in my report that I don't what's happening with attempts to control greenhouse gas emissions around the world as governments are increasingly trying to steer their economies towards achieving net zero. We'll touch on what's been done in the past and how the direction might be taken in the future, focusing particularly on the idea of hubs and clusters. And then we'll look at some of the bigger developments taking place in Europe and elsewhere and how this could encourage the wider uptake of the technology with a particular focus on Asia. Now, so far, a growing number of countries have announced, or at least considering, net zero emission targets. Media reports vary, but some say the number is now over 100 and others suggest that it's approaching 200. And that covers nearly 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, targets for achieving net zero vary, but most of them seem to be falling in the range 2045 to 2070 at the moment. For example, Sweden and Germany have set legally binding targets for 2045, whereas France, Denmark, Spain, Hungary and the UK are targeting 2050, as are Japan, South Korea, Canada, plus numerous others. Now, based on work carried out by a number of major organisations that include the International Panel on Climate Change, the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and the International Energy Agency, carbon capture, utilisation and storage, or CCUS, looks set to play an important role in the future. As it's the countries we've just mentioned, along with many others, try to move towards net zero by mid-century or thereabouts. So far, more than 20 countries have mentioned an interest in carbon capture in their nationally determined contributions that were developed as part of the Paris Agreement. And it's being increasingly accepted that CCUS is going to have an important role to play in the coming years, especially in the thermal power sector and other hard-to-abate areas such as iron and steel manufacture, chemicals, cement, and hydrogen production from fossil fuels. There are currently around 30 major facilities around the world that include carbon capture as part of their operations. And there are also many others at various stages in the development process. Now, this table shows the situation last year, and since then the total amount of CO2 captured has increased a bit from just under 43 million tonnes a year to around 45. And the number of operational units, I think, is the last figure I've seen, is suggesting about 38 now. So we now have a growing number of CCUS projects being developed as governments and industry begin to appreciate the potential of the technology and the environmental and commercial possibilities it can open up. And this is something we'll look at in more detail shortly. But although the number of projects is growing, there's general agreement that it's not fast enough and it's taking far too long to get the technology widely installed and working. To reach net zero by mid-century, global uptake needs to expand it enormously from current levels. As we just heard, these are currently around 45 million tonnes a year, but estimates from various studies suggest it may need to be up to at least 4.2 gigatons a year by 2050. In fact, the latest net zero emissions scenario produced by the IEA suggests it may need to be more than 7 gigatons. So estimates vary quite widely, with some suggesting that globally between 70 and 225 gigatons of CO2 will need to be removed over the next 3 decades. But the major problem is many organizations are still reluctant to move ahead with major projects, concerned about issues such as, well, for instance, the current level of development, the need for large-scale demonstration, and the fact that capital costs and technical risk are simply too high for many individual companies to face. Now, carbon capture from industrial combustion processes is not new. It's been around for several decades, but in most cases it's been applied to industrial processing rather than as a means for decarbonisation. Many of these earlier applications focused on a single point source, such as an individual coal-fired power plant, for instance. And there were several of these operating in the USA where CO2 was captured from flue gases and used commercially for applications such as food processing, freezing, beverage production and chilling. Elsewhere in the world, individual plants also captured CO2 for food and drink sectors in Malaysia, Japan and Brazil, and CO2 captured from coal-fired boilers was also used in the production of minerals such as sodium sulfate, borax and soda ash. Now, although different technologies were deployed, they all had one common factor in that they were standalone plants with capture systems dedicated solely to one operation. So their success hinged entirely on how well the overall package was operating, with the plant operator covering any technical and financial risks involved. For example, the coal-fired Shady Point power plant shown here in Oklahoma in the USA had a post-combustion capture system that came online in 1991, tied solely to its own operation. But more recently, emphasis has switched to tackling CO2 emissions from larger point sources, especially coal-fired power plants. For example, SaskPower's Boundary Dam capture project in Canada and the Petronova project in the USA. Now, despite some teething problems, both of these first-of-a-kind projects have helped confirm the technical viability of deploying carbon capture on coal-fired power plants. But again, both captured and transported CO2 from a single source. Which brings us to the idea of hubs and clusters. Now, some of these early capture projects we've just heard about worked very well for many years, but they were only capable of handling relatively small amounts of CO2. In the case of the Shady Point plant, for instance, it was around 200 tonnes a day. And of course, much of the CO2 was only temporarily stored in beverages and so on. Most eventually made its way back to the atmosphere. More recently, emphasis has switched from the development of such standalone projects to what's generally termed the hub and cluster concept. Now, in terms of cost effectiveness, especially as the focus has now shifted to large-scale carbon capture and storage as a means for tackling climate change, most proposed capture systems will only make economic sense where they've got easy access to suitably sized enabling infrastructure, pipelines and so on, needed to transport and store captured CO2. Of course, to develop such a shared system can be both expensive and technically challenging, but the overriding feature is that instead of individual power plants or industrial processes adopting their own dedicated carbon capture, transport and storage systems, shared infrastructure will allow multiple carbon emitters to link up and use the same network, treat captured CO2 and transport it to a suitable storage site that potentially could be some considerable distance away. There are many places around the world where power plants and industrial facilities have been built close to each other. Often these areas are densely packed with industrial and commercial activities. So that, in a nutshell, is our cluster. So why have these industrial clusters grown up in certain specific places, and what sort of things are they made up of? Well, historically, many emissions-intensive industries have developed in the same area. This can often include things such as coal and gas-fired power plants, oil refining, natural gas processing, hydrogen production, and so on. Now, such clusters have grown up for a number of reasons. They're often been encouraged by easy access to local fuels, such as coal and other raw materials, availability of electricity, good access to transport links, such as ports and rail networks that allow better access to markets, and of course, labour that's been available locally. More often than not, it's been a combination of these factors. The industrial clusters are found pretty much in all of the world's developed and developing economies. For example, in Europe, there are many large fossil fuel-fired power plants and industrial plants clustered around major ports such as Rotterdam, Antwerp, Duisburg, Merseyside, Le Havre, and so on. And there are many others. So our hub, or collection hub, is a facility that will serve multiple sources of CO2 from within the same geographical area with a shared CO2 transport and storage or utilization structure. The hub could be a central CO2 collection or distribution point and possibly even serve more than one cluster. So what are some of the potential benefits of following this route? Well, as we've already mentioned, hub and cluster networks are expected to play a key role in efforts to scale up carbon capture. And connecting multiple emitters to shared common infrastructure can provide a number of advantages, some of which are shown here. Obviously, time means we can't go through all of them, but for example, they can help countries meet their CO2 reduction targets. They can make the whole process cheaper and less risky, especially for smaller emitters. And they can open up CO2 transport and storage to companies that might otherwise not be able to afford them. On the commercial front, they can also help boost local economic development and may even help kickstart more industrial development in the particular area. Many processes or single plants are of a relatively small capacity and only generate, let's say, modest CO2 streams, making the economics of standalone capture, transport and storage challenging, to say the least. But focusing on groups of industrial sources and linking them in this way helps make the whole process much more viable. So gathering and combining multiple CO2 streams minimizes the technical and financial risk for individual network users, making it much easier for them to decarbonize. Now, you might imagine that smaller emitters don't matter too much, but combined, they can have a significant impact. If we look at the USA, for example, well, there are nearly 5,000 individual facilities there that each produce less than 200,000 tons of CO2 a year. But combined, this amounts to nearly 300 million tons. This represents nearly 16% of all US industrial emissions. So it's important that smaller emitters are able to decarbonize as well as larger ones. And the hub and cluster concept can help this make this a practical reality. But of course, it's not all plain sailing, and possible deployment needs to be scaled up significantly. Hubs and clusters are going to make a meaningful contribution towards mitigating global climate change. There are still various obstacles to be overcome before the hubs and clusters idea can really take off. These can include things such as legal and regulatory issues. For example, the safety of CO2 transport and storage is often subject to strict protocols for handling and monitoring, and all of these, of course, need to be addressed. Crucially, government policies and incentives can play a major role in pushing the technology forward and helping to encourage investment in new CCUS infrastructure projects. And they can do this in a number of ways, and some of the more important ones are shown here. So if we look at the first point, for example, well, government actions are going to be needed to help create financial incentives, something that's going to be particularly important when it comes to getting new projects underway. And this is being tackled in different ways. So in the USA, for example, well, in the last few years, we've seen encouragement through the introduction of what's called the 45Q tax credit scheme and the Inflation Reduction Act. Whereas in neighbouring Canada, we've seen the introduction of a carbon pricing incentive, encouraging industrial emitters to cut their greenhouse gas emissions. It's all very much horses for courses, as the situation varies between individual countries or even regions, often reflecting their particular needs and existing economic makeup. And aside from technical and economic issues, it's going to be increasingly important to get the public behind these developments. At the moment, there's often a woeful lack of understanding and appreciation of just how important they're likely to become in the future. So before we take a look at some of the major projects being developed around the world, let's just briefly summarise where we are. The hub and cluster model for CCUS has the potential to provide important benefits, especially with economies of scale and sharing of financial and technical risk. Developing suitably located capture hubs could play a major role in allowing businesses of different scale to decarbonise in a cost-effective way. In fact, the presence of a hub could even attract traditionally hard-to-abate industries to a particular region. However, there are still challenges to be overcome, partly as it's a relatively new concept. But ideally, government support will be provided and investment is likely to come from both government sources as well as the private sector. And considerable investment is going to be needed to enable the concept to be deployed at large scale. But now let's move on and look at some of the projects in places where there's significant activity in terms of CCUS and potential hub and cluster developments. The main regions covered in my report are Europe, North America, and Asia. As part of this, I've looked into projects and prospects in the UK, the Netherlands, the USA, Canada, China, Indonesia, India, Japan, and Australia. Now, we clearly don't have time to talk in depth about all of these, so we'll look at a few examples to give us some idea of what's happening around the world. As you've heard, there are a number of important hub projects at varying stages in their development, so I thought it might be interesting to talk about what's happening in Europe and Asia and compare how things are happening in both. So, what's the state of play in Europe? Well, with many projects, the situation is quite similar. Many plans are still at early stages, government approval is being sought, environmental permits applied for, and investors are being pursued. So this isn't going to be a quick or easy process, as numerous agencies and private firms are usually involved, each often focused on a particular part of the chain. So, for instance, some will specialise in capture, some in CO2 transport, and others in final storage. Others may not be involved on the technical side, simply providing financial backing or project insurance. So many factors are involved, and there are still plenty of hurdles to be overcome. Now, turning to Europe as a whole, well, each year, the European energy sector emits around 3.9 gigatons of CO2. The power sector is responsible for about a third of this. Emissions of around 800 million tonnes also come from energy-intensive industries such as iron and steel production, cement manufacturing, chemicals production. Overall, CO2 emissions from European heat and power plants, industrial sites and waste management plants are around 2.4 gigatons a year, or nearly 2/3 of all European CO2 emissions. Now, if this is going to be tackled in an effective way, CCUS is going to have an important role to play. And in fact, it's one of the EU's 7 what they term strategic building blocks, and is considered crucial in achieving net zero by 2050. Now, as well, planned European decarbonisation efforts are increasingly focused on the use of hubs and clusters. Most European countries have large CO2 emitting clusters, making them ideal locations for development of capture and transport hubs. But this is only part of the story, as fortunately there are also large CO2 storage formations, such as those beneath the North Sea Basin and the Baltic Sea, that have the potential to store many gigatons of CO2. And of course, being offshore, they avoid issues of public concerns about onshore storage, something we've seen quite a bit of upset in recent years in parts of mainland Europe. Opportunities for onshore geographical storage in mainland Europe are likely to be more limited, although there may be possibilities in parts of Eastern Europe where CO2 is already being ejected for enhanced oil recovery. The development of a number of major hub and cluster projects is continuing to move forward in Europe, driven partly by environmental and economic concerns, but more recently, also by moves to strengthen the bloc's energy security as it moves away from Russian sources of energy following the invasion of Ukraine. Now, in the report, I go into some detail as to the current state of development of selected European projects and any plans announced for how other projects might proceed in the future. Most European countries appear to have at least some interest in possible hub and cluster development, and the report looks at a selection of projects that all appear to have at least a reasonable chance of going ahead more or less as planned. The particular projects reported on are the one shown here. And by way of example, the map here gives you some idea of the scale and type of developments that are happening or proposed in the northern half of the UK. As you can see, there's quite a bit of activity planned for the region, with a number of major projects in the planning or development stage, a situation that's being replicated elsewhere in Europe. So by way of example, I thought it might be interesting to look at what's happening in the UK, where the government is committed to CCUS and announced that it will ensure that at least 4 suitably equipped industrial clusters are developed in the future. In March of this year, it pledged £20 billion for the further development of CCUS. And the government wants between 20 and 30 million tonnes a year of CO2, or roughly 10% of current UK emissions, to be captured and stored by 2030. Much of this will be destined for storage beneath parts of the North Sea. And in June 2022, the UK's first carbon storage licensing round was launched, which focused on 13 potential sites covering an area of no less than 12,000 square kilometres. These are mainly a mix of saline aquifers and depleted oil and gas fields. But looking further ahead, project developers are also hoping to eventually offer CO2 storage to emitters not just here in the UK, but also from continental Europe and elsewhere. As we've just heard, in Northern England, several major projects are being developed around the rivers Tees and Humber, the location of a diverse group of co-located industrial power, oil refining and hydrogen companies, many hoping to decarbonise. In fact, the Humber region is the UK's largest CO2 emitting industrial cluster, producing more than 12 million tonnes a year. At the moment, major international players such as BP, for instance, are getting increasingly involved in proposals for the region, and it's anticipated that many local industrial emitters would eventually link up to the proposed shared pipeline and infrastructure systems. Now let's just look briefly at where the UK's power sector fits into all this. There are several important power projects proposed or in development, all of which will eventually be connected to an appropriate capture hub. As we all know, the bulk of the UK's coal-fired power capacity has been eliminated in recent years, so carbon capture won't feature in this area, although several other gas and biomass-fired power plant projects are being pursued. So we have the 3 gas power plants shown here, as well as a major biomass-fired project in the shape of the Drax power plant. And the schematic to the right here just shows you in a very simplified form to give you an idea where some of the CO2 will be captured in its journey towards final storage beneath the North Sea. The UK government is providing additional funding to accelerate projects such as these by the end of the decade as part of its plans for the UK to reach net zero by 2050. So before we move on, just to recap, well, most European countries have one or more industrial clusters that have often developed over the past century or so and comprise mixtures of power generation and other industrial operations. Given that many are close to each other and are seeking to decarbonise, there are significant possibilities for them to combine their efforts and concentrate on developing suitable shared open-end access infrastructure with all the benefits that we heard about earlier. Now let's just see what's happening on the other side of the world. We'll take a quick look at what's going on in Japan. Well, Japan's the world's 5th biggest CO2 emitter, although overall levels have gone down a bit in recent years. The country is famously short of indigenous energy resources, and with only limited nuclear power online, relies heavily on fossil fuels. That coal and natural gas are used to generate much of the country's electricity. Coal power remains important to the economy as it provides roughly 1/3 of the total, and it's likely to stay that way for some time, as Japan has the world's most efficient coal power fleet, one that's set to carry on operating for many years. Now, despite planned changes in the power sector, coal is still expected to make up around 1/4 of the energy mix in 2030. So the future decarbonisation of the sector is an important issue, and the Japanese government views CCUS as an essential part of achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. It's been actively promoting CCUS both at home and internationally, and for example, last year, cooperation agreements were signed with Indonesia on CCUS, amongst other things. Now, several projects are underway or planned, and the government's pledged to encourage further development by 2030. Ongoing projects include carbon capture from coal-fired and biomass co-fired power plants, IGCC plants, and a hydrogen production unit. And further possibilities include methanol and ammonia production. The government foresees the creation of a number of major hubs in Japan, but as elsewhere, will provide open access for multiple CO2 emitters. So what's the situation with storing CO2 in Japan at the moment? Well, in January of this year, as part of a long-term roadmap for CCUS, the Japanese organisation METI set a target for CO2 storage capacity of between 6 and 12 million tonnes a year by 2030, but with a view to it increasing substantially during the next decade or so. Estimates suggest at the moment that Japan has potential storage capacity of around 240 gigatons. So far, several important sites have been examined, and Japanese developers are looking for others, some overseas in countries such as Indonesia. Now, a few months ago, the Japan Organization for Metals and Energy Security, or JOGMEC, announced the selection of 7 advanced CCUS projects that they're calling role model projects. These were chosen with a view to scaling up and boosting the uptake of the technology, along with reducing any costs by 2030, all part of the process of taking projects in deployment forward to a commercial scale. The intention is that CO2 will be captured from industrial clusters in Hokkaido, Kanto, Chubu, Kinki, Setouchi, and the Kyushu regions. And the map here, it's far too much detail, but just to give you an idea of the geographical spread. And the table indicates the scale and type of operation involved. 5 of these projects will store captured CO2 in Japan, and the other 2 elsewhere in Asia. It's expected that between them, they'll be able to capture and store around 13 million tonnes a year of CO2 by 2030. And JOGMEC hopes that through these initial role model projects, this will have increased to somewhere between 120 and 240 million tonnes a year by 2050. It's anticipated that up to 20 major CCUS projects will eventually be developed. So looking ahead, well, Japan seems to be taking the issue very seriously, with the government actively pursuing a number of projects, some of which are already underway. It considers that without the significant uptake of CCUS, it will be impossible for the country to meet its net zero commitments, largely because of its reliance on fossil fuels to drive economic growth. Encouragingly, though, Japan aims to share the knowledge and practical experience gained from these projects, with a view to encouraging similar developments in other Asian countries and beyond. Now, Asia includes the world's largest CO2 emitters. In 2022, global emissions were nearly 37 gigatons. China alone was responsible for around 12 gigatons of this total. In particular, both China and India have large and growing coal power fleets. They are relatively young. Despite apparent attempts to diversify their energy sectors, coal capacity has continued to increase in recent years. However, it's also increased in Asian countries such as Indonesia, Bangladesh, the Philippines, and Vietnam, for example. The coal-fired power fleet in the ASEAN region includes some of the newest plants in the world, and in 2022, their average age was only 11.8 years. So the elimination of coal power at any time soon is not a realistic option, as many of these countries are still heavily dependent on their coal-fired plants, most of them which are unlikely to retire in the next 10, 20 years, or quite possibly even longer. Any sudden closure of scale would create real challenges in terms of finance and investment, as well as have serious impacts on national energy security, the reliability of power systems, and of course employment. So the widespread take-up of CCUS throughout the region will be important. So what's the current situation regarding CCUS in Asia as a whole, if we can call it that? Well, some regional governments have recognised the importance in addressing greenhouse gas mitigation targets while still allowing for the provision of affordable energy. However, the degree of interest varies considerably between individual Asian countries. Some are actively promoting the technology, whereas others are still watching how things might proceed before committing themselves. So there's not really yet a full consensus on future regional developments. For instance, as we hear, the Japanese government has accepted the need to control greenhouse gas emissions, but is pushing for an Asian energy transition and climate change mitigation strategy that won't damage the region's economic growth. It considers that developing countries in Asia are in a different position to those in Europe and North America. It is hoped that at least some of the experience gained in CCUS and hub and cluster development in both will be transferable and replicated and allow for the rapid uptake within Asia as a whole. So we've heard something about the developments taking place in Europe and parts of Asia, but the report also takes a look at recent activities and plans in the countries shown here. Now, we have to bear in mind that each individual country will have access to a different mix of energy resources and is likely to have objectives that are tailored to meet its own needs and requirements, so the outlook won't necessarily be the same. But generally, for each country, the report looks at issues such as policy support, what kind of measures governments are planning or considering, CCUS projects and proposals and development, CO2 storage potential and options, hub and cluster development, and it also provides an update of the most recent activities or developments taking place in each country. So by way of example, just let's look briefly at a major project being developed in the USA. Well, carbon management is expected to play an important role in meeting US emissions reduction, and ongoing hub developments are being tailored to fit into various particular regions' energy assets, their industrial activities, and what potential storage options they might have. Recently, the US-based Great Plains Institute identified nearly 550 US facilities as prime candidates for carbon capture retrofit over the next 10 to 15 years, of course, where the economics look favourable, but with the aim of these relying on the creation of suitable hubs and shared infrastructure. For example, there are plans for a major capture hub in the area around Houston in Texas, where there are a host of fossil-fired fuel-powered plants and a wide variety of other CO2 emitters co-located in the same area. At the moment, discussions are continuing with many individual emitters in the region with a view to providing open shared access to capture, transport and storage infrastructure that will be developed. So let's start to bring things to a close. Where countries still rely on fossil fuels for at least part of their energy mix, there's been something of a realization that CCUS will be important in helping control emissions. Although interest in CCUS has increased quite substantially in recent years and the number of projects and proposals has grown, global uptake needs to increase enormously from current capture levels. Understandably, the degree of interest in CCUS and its place in the energy transition is going to vary between countries and regions. And this is going to be influenced by factors such as the scale and type of energy resources each has, the capacity and age of the power fleet and other industrial installations, and the amount of accessible and affordable CO2 storage capacity available. Political will and the introduction of suitable policy measures will also be major factors, as will public acceptance of the technology, and of course financial support. The actions taken by governments in particular will be important, as they have the power and influence to provide encouragement and incentives to help drive the whole process forward. So what's the global status at the moment? Well, so far much of the world's CCUS activity has been in North America and Europe. Both the USA and Canada have had a lot of experience, particularly in enhanced oil recovery operations. And in Europe, 2 major natural gas power plants, projects have been in operation for several decades. It's generally accepted that CCUS will be needed for the continued sustainable use of fossil fuels. It's going to be important to build on this existing infrastructure and experience as hub and cluster projects become a reality. It's hoped that information and operational experience from the more heavily industrialized economies will help speed up CCUS deployment in less developed nations, especially some of those we heard about in Asia, that in recent years have seen significant economic growth and industrialization. Collaboration between countries, technology developers, and other organizations is going to be vital in spreading information that will help encourage the widespread uptake of CCUS, especially through the use of hubs and clusters. And knowledge sharing and technology transfer will help drive this process. So how are things progressing out there? Well, on the positive side, just last week, the final investment decision was made for a major multi-partner project in the Netherlands, the Porthos project that I talk about in my report. And construction has now been set to start in 2024. But not everything is going so smoothly. And a couple of weeks ago, a planned $1.3 billion, 1,300-mile CO2 pipeline across the US Midwest was cancelled because of a combination of what they're calling regulatory and government processes, plus objections from environmental groups and landowners. So overall, it's something of a mixed picture, but generally most projects do seem to be gradually moving forward, and over the next decade or so, should start to make a real contribution towards global decarbonisation. So just to close, there's been a growing awareness of the importance of CCUS in helping meet climate change targets and the benefits that can be provided by adopting the hub and cluster model as a means for scaling up the technology. Hopefully, at least some of these will become a reality and help make a real difference in what's becoming an increasingly carbon-controlled world. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentation. I hope you found it interesting. Let's just see if we have any questions. I've got one that came a little bit earlier. Can I just check this? I was a bit surprised to see that captured CO2 could be transported by ship. Can this be done in an economic and safe way? Very good question. The short answer is yes. And it's an area that there's a growing number of large international firms that are getting involved in. Obviously, in many cases, CO2 pipelines are the obvious way to move large amounts of CO2 around, but sometimes the distances we're talking about, the technical difficulties and the cost are just too high, especially when we're talking about storage sites that might be beneath an ocean floor. Depending on the particular scheme, of course, there may not be enough CO2 being collected to justify the cost of a pipeline, or the particular project may not be expected to continue for long enough to make it cost effective. So at the end of the day, realistically, the decision on which way to go will depend on factors such as these, but of course, quite a few others, like the actual geography and topography in and around the individual storage site, for instance. At the moment, there are a number of big international companies that are interested in moving CO2 by ship, and they are developing large capacity ships for actually transporting it. This includes, for instance, on top of my head, Shell is involved with this, as indeed are Mitsubishi Shipbuilding in Japan, amongst others. I did read some recent analysis that suggested that in the near term, I think between 600 and 700 marine vessels could well be needed for these projects that are being developed, with countries such as, I think it was Japan, Norway, and the UK are including the use of large-scale CO2 shipping as part of the overall strategy. So, sorry, a bit of a long answer, but the answer to that is yes, shipping by moving CO2 by ship is reality, and it can be done, and it does certainly look an economic way forward for some projects.
Thank you.
We don't seem to have any more questions at the moment, but if anyone would like to contact me further down the line, I will obviously do my best to answer your questions. But thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. And all that's left for me to say is the slides from this webinar will be available to download from our webinar page shortly. And thank you all for joining us today, and goodbye.